Okay, let's take a look at what you learned in lesson 1.5. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I'd like you to answer them negatively, even if it's not true. Just give me a negative response. Est-ce que tu habites à Chicago? Est-ce que tu habites à Chicago? Okay, hopefully you said non. Now that first non is not the negation. That is simply responding negatively to the question. You're going to negate the verb in just a moment. So again, non, je ne, now the verb habiter, we're going to chop it because with je, we take the I sound off the end of the verb. Je ne habite pas à Chicago. Now, you know there's one mistake in there, hopefully. That's that ne and habite should form a contraction. So, je n'habite pas à Chicago. Voilà. Let's try another question. Est-ce que tu fais le lit? Est-ce que tu fais le lit? Notice I'm using the kind of question, which is the first type of question you've learned, which starts with the word est-ce que. Est-ce que tu... And another thing, notice that I'm speaking to you familiarly. I'm using tu in speaking to you because I'm assuming that the majority of the audience watching this video is composed of students, young students in a classroom or homeschooled students, and therefore in the role of teacher, you would speak to me using vous, but I, as your instructor, speaking to younger people, would use tu, the familiar form in speaking with you. So let's go back to the question. Est-ce que tu fais le lit? Est-ce que tu fais le lit? Oui ou non? Okay, you should have answered negatively. You'd say non. Okay, that's not the negation. That's just the answer yes or no. Non. Je ne fais pas le lit. Notice that you had faire and you chop the ending off because je requires you to chop the re sound off the end of the verb. Je ne fais pas le lit. I certainly hope that's not true. But nonetheless, were it true, I wouldn't need to know it. All that matters to me is that you form that question, that statement negatively correctly. Well done. Next question. Est-ce que tu écoutes de la musique classique? Est-ce que tu écoutes de la musique classique? Okay, you'd respond non. Je ne écoute. Does that sound right? Je ne écoute, that's kind of awkward. What should it be? Right, n'écoute. Je n'écoute pas de la musique classique. Je n'écoute pas de la musique classique. Okay? Next. Est-ce que tu laves la vaisselle? Est-ce que tu laves la vaisselle? Oui ou non? Well, again, for the sake of your family, I hope this is not true. But you should have answered, non, je ne lave pas la vaisselle. Je ne lave pas la vaisselle. Okay, let me ask you questions about this young man right here. And let's see how that changes your responses a little bit. Or at least changes my questions. You'll notice some contractions I'll need to make. Est-ce qu'il habite à Détroit? Est-ce que il, what should that truly be? Que il. Right. Est-ce qu'il habite à Détroit? Oui ou non? Answer negatively. That's right. You'd say non. Il ne habite pas à Détroit. But ne habite should be n'habite. Voilà. Non. Il n'habite pas à Détroit. Okay. Next question. Est-ce qu'il fait le lit? Est-ce qu'il fait le lit? Oui ou non? That's it. You'd say non. Il ne fait pas le lit. Hein? Il ne fait pas le lit. Numéro 3. Est-ce qu'il écoute de la musique classique? Oui ou non? Okay. Non. Il ne écoute. You know that's not ne écoute. Huh? Catch it even before we start to say it incorrectly. What is it? What contraction does that make? Right. Il n'écoute pas de la musique classique. And last of all, est-ce qu'il lave la vaisselle? Oui ou non? Good. Non, you say non, il ne lave pas la vaisselle. Non, il ne lave pas la vaisselle. Okay, let's turn it around now and have you ask the questions and I'll give the answers. But this time you're going to ask the questions of me, okay? You're going to ask about my life. And so, are you going to refer to me as tu? Are you going to say vous? Which should you use? Right, because you don't truly know me personally, because I'm an older person, old as the hills, and because I'm in authority in the class, you might say, you would use vous, speaking to me respectfully. You'd use vous. So ask me, first of all, if I live in Chicago, which is Chicago. Oh, I use an American name. Let's take Paris. Huh? Ask me if I live in Paris. Paris. Okay, you should have started off your question with est-ce que? And after that, it's easy. You should just form a statement after the word est-ce que. Est-ce que vous habitez? What's the ending of the verb when vous is a subject? It's always est. So, est-ce que vous habitez à Paris? And I'll respond negatively since we're practicing negative statements, and it's true currently. Non, je ne habite pas, contraction, right? Je n'habite pas à Paris. Non, je n'habite pas à Paris. J'habite plutôt à Détroit. Okay. Ask me now if I make the bed. That's a tough one. Don't forget, this is a bizarre verb conjugation here. It's not vous ferez like you wish it were. Okay, hopefully you said, est-ce que vous faites? Est-ce que vous faites le lit? This is not true at all, but I'll say, non, je ne fais pas le lit. Je ne fais pas le lit. Notice I took faire and I chopped it because je requires me to chop off that final sound at the end of the verb. Je ne fais pas le lit. All right. Third, ask me if I listen to rock music. Okay, you're starting all your questions at this point with est-ce que. So, est-ce que vous écoutez de la musique rock? De la musique rock. Et ma réponse est non, which is not completely true either, but non. Je n'écoute pas de la musique rock. Je n'écoute pas de la musique rock. And fourth of all, ask me if I wash the dishes. Your question should have been, est-ce que vous lavez la vaisselle? Est-ce que vous lavez la vaisselle? And this is completely false, but non, je ne lave pas la vaisselle. Non, je ne lave pas la vaisselle. Okay, good. Let me hear you ask now questions of me about this young man here. The same questions, but about this young fellow. We'll go a little faster here, but this is going to require you to be careful about some contractions. Ask me if he lives in Detroit, which is Détroit. Okay, you should have asked, est-ce que il, but that's not good. That doesn't flow together smoothly like it should. What should it be? What's the contraction? Que, remember, short French word ending in e, followed by a word that starts with a vowel sound. Il, my mouth is open, it's a vowel sound. Que il forms qu'il. So, est-ce qu'il habite à Détroit was your question. Non, il n'habite pas à Détroit. Okay, ask me now if he makes the bed. Okay, this should flow quickly now because we've already worked on est-ce qu'il in the first question. Now in the second question, it's the same thing. Est-ce qu'il fait le lit is what you should have asked me. And I would say, non, il ne fait pas le lit. Hein? Number 3, ask me if he listens to classical music. Okay, you should have said, est-ce qu'il écoute de la musique classique? And my response is, non, il n'écoute pas de la musique classique. And last of all, ask me if he washes the dishes, la vaisselle, the dishes. Right, that's it, very good. You asked, est-ce qu'il lave la vaisselle? And my response is, non, il ne lave pas la vaisselle. Good. Now, in lesson 1.6, you're going to learn the second way in which a question can be formed in French. And this is by means of what's called inversion. Inversion is taking what's usually the subject of the sentence in the first position, and then the verb in the second position in the sentence in a statement, and you're going to invert them. You're going to reverse their order, placing the verb first, followed by the subject. And that's going to require a little bit of reflection at one point, and I'll explain that to you. So, for example, if you wanted to ask the same question of, let's say, if I want to ask the question of you about if you live in Chicago, I'll say, usually I would say, tu habites, when I'm making a statement. Tu habites à Chicago, okay? Now to make it a question, I can reverse those words and I say, habites-tu à Chicago? Of course, I have a quizzical look on my face, and I also raise my voice at the end of the statement to show that's not a statement, it's a question. Habites-tu à Chicago? And you'd answer, oui, j'habite à Chicago, ou non, je n'habite pas à Chicago, whatever your answer happens to be. Okay? Now, if I want to ask you if you make the bed, instead of saying tu fais, you make. Tu fais, I will say, fais-tu le lit? Okay? So that's not particularly difficult, not particularly challenging. The same would apply if you were asking me a question. Let's see you try and do it already. Ask me if I listen to rock music. Okay, remember, you're speaking to me formally, respectfully. You're going to use vous. Okay, normally you're going to say vous écoutez de la musique classique, but it's a question you want. So what do you have to do with the first two words, vous and écoutez? Right, you'll say, écoutez-vous de la musique classique, and that forms a question by inverting the subject and the verb. And my answer is, oui, j'écoute de la musique classique, or non, je n'écoute pas de la musique classique. Ask me last of all if I wash the dishes, la vaisselle, using the second form of question, of course. Yeah, normally you'd say, vous lavez la vaisselle, make it a question. Lavez-vous la vaisselle? Lavez-vous la vaisselle? Okay. Now, up to that point, that's not particularly complicated. You did very well in picking up already on how inversion functions. However, what if we're talking about another person? We're talking about, let's say, this girl right here. How would you ask me? Well, let me. Yeah, you tell me. How would you ask me if she lives in Paris, in Paris? Okay, normally you would say, remember in a statement you'd say, elle habite. Elle habite, so in a question you would say, habite-elle? Habite-elle à Paris? The problem is, as you see a question like this in the lesson, and as you hear the response, you won't hear exactly that. You won't hear habite-elle. You'll hear habite-t-elle. Did you hear the slight difference? You will not hear habite-elle. You'll hear habite-t-elle. There's a slight hesitation in there between habite and elle, and you heard an extra t sound appear. Now this is to cause the words to flow together more smoothly. As we're talking about this idea of making the words flow together more smoothly, and I say we're adding a t sound between the inverted subject and verb, don't confuse this with the idea of adding additional letters necessarily. We're not talking about the written language at this time, about how things appear in text. We're talking about sound and how the language is to be spoken. And so when you use inversion, in order to cause the subject and the verb to flow together more smoothly, if, and this is the key, if that subject pronoun or personal pronoun begins with a vowel sound, that means either il or elle, before the il and elle, you're going to insert the sound t, t, t. So, for example, talking about this girl, habite-t-elle à Paris? Or fait-elle, elle fait, invert, fait-elle le lit? Or écoute-t-elle, hear the extra t in there, écoute-t-elle de la musique rock? Or lave-t-elle, hear the little t in there, lave-t-elle la vaisselle? Okay, and so as you go through the exercises in lesson 1.4, as you hear this little t sound, which appears that, or which suddenly is heard, which you wouldn't have anticipated, realize that it's there before a personal pronoun in an inverted question. if that personal pronoun begins with a vowel sound, that is to say your mouth open. Il, elle. Well, there is one more matter I'd like to point out to you in lesson 1.6, because it's a kind of exercise that you haven't dealt with before. So let's go to lesson 1.6 at this time. So here you see lesson 1.6, and in the second section we come to a typical timing activity where we open the stopwatch, and then we choose run, right mouse click, choose always on top, put it up out of the way. And here you're simply supposed to say the words that correspond to the images within a certain period of time, which is 36 seconds. This is something you've done before. I might want to point out a couple things. Notice that we have two symbols here. This time we don't have pictures of me doing a gesture, but in this case we have a symbol. And you know that this symbol corresponds to a negative statement. And of course, two words are necessary to form that negative statement, which are ne and pas. So that's what you would say within this exercise when you see this symbol. For this particular symbol here, this is the first, see the number 1 here, the first way you learned of forming a question, and that the gesture and the sound you would make are est-ce que, when you come to that symbol. Okay, so you'd go je, in effect here you don't have to form the gesture, so you simply say ne pas, dire, est-ce que, vous, etc. You've done this kind of activity before, but when you get to section 3, here it looks like there's an enormous mistake. Here it looks like the internet has failed to download certain images, and therefore you may as well skip past this section. No, not at all. This is intentional. These are not undownloaded images. These are black squares, black rectangles I should say. And these rectangles simply tell you that this is, and you see the red border, something on which you need to click. As you click on it, you're going to hear a word said, one of the pronouns or the verbs that you've learned up to this point, and you are to perform the gestures you see here in the symbolic directions. Your role is to perform the gesture. You don't need to repeat the word, you just do the gesture. So as I click on it,
Je.
I'll perform the gesture that corresponds to the sound that I hear. I go on to the next of these black rectangles.
Écoutez.
I click on it, and I perform the gesture that corresponds to the sound I hear.
Habiter.
Such as this.
Il.
Now imagine some young man over here to whom I'm pointing.
Faire.
Ne pas. I don't have to say the word, I simply perform the gesture, etc. Okay? So this is what you do in the course of this particular exercise. It's something new, and recognize that it's not just something which you are to do in this exercise, but you will be required to perform the same kind of activity at the beginning of the 4 tests that exist at the end of this lesson. I think that's it. I'll see you at the beginning of next class. Au revoir.